around time. Okay. All right. Thank you for being here. This is the session on COVID-19 and the labor market. So we have three papers in this session. So Julia is going to start, then Nicolas is going to take the lead, and then I'm in the last spot. So, okay, the rules of the game. If you have any questions as we present, please turn on your phone, your audio or whatever, and just ask the question right away. Thank you. I think each of us has like 25 minutes, right? Okay, go ahead, Julia. Thank you.
Thank you, Gustavo. And thank you all for being here. I'm very happy to present this work on informality during COVID in Latin America, implications and policy options. And this is joint work with Ivonne Acevedo from the Centro de Estudios Educativos y Sociales in Mexico, Francesca Castellani, also at the Inter-American Development Bank, and Miguel Sekeli at the Centro de Estudios Educativos y Sociales. Usual disclaimer, the presentation does not reflect the opinions of the bank or its boards, but simply of the authors. So preview of the results, it's gonna be a short version of the paper, but basically we will see that in Latin America experienced a virtuous cycle of growth in the last period. And since 2014, this kind of stopped and the labor market composition remained kind of the same. But then COVID-19 happened and it had an unprecedented impact on everything, including labor markets. And this meant a big increase in the share of inactive population and also a large decrease in the informality share. The formal sector saw a decrease in the share of employed, but it was way more stable. And so we say that it became kind of a social safety net, given its stronger flexibility and stronger rigidity and less flexibility. What we expect in the future is that informality might actually go to levels that were higher than before the pandemic. And why do we think that this could happen? Because many people that went towards inactivity will have to come back to the labor market and probably will take their previous informal jobs. But not only, we also think that because of the income loss that people experienced during the pandemic, we might see an overshoot. So more people of informality, so more people looking for jobs to compensate for the income loss that they experienced, and the jobs that could be more available would be the ones in the informal sector. So this is what we think could happen. And so if that can happen, we explore some of the policies that could help to mitigate this growth of informality. And for that, we look at mostly three policies. Two in the short term, which are forgiving income tax payments and social security contributions, which would give more resources to the government. And so what if those resources were used to help the labor market and increase the generation of formal jobs? And we expect that to cushion the increase in informality between 50 and 70%. 75%. And then we explore also another policy more in the medium long run. And we look at the educational improvement of the population. And by that, we mean if the population increased its education by on average 1 year, which is obviously something that to be achieved requires more time. That's why we say medium long term. And that could have also the potential to mitigate 50% of the increase. The outline, so first of all, we're going to look at the dynamics of the labor market composition in Latin America between 2006 and up to before COVID, then how COVID-19 affected the labor markets, and then the adjustments and the perspective that we think could happen in the following years, and how the mitigation policies that I just mentioned could help to reduce informality in Latin America. So this is a graph that shows you the dynamics in the composition of the labor market. The blue line depicts the formal share of workers in the working age population. As you can see, there was a positive increase in the formal share up to 2014. At that point, it kind of peaked and remained stable. And this is mirrored by the red line, if you see it, that decreased continuously up to 2014 and then remained kind of stable. The inactivity, so a decreasing trend throughout the period, whereas unemployment is the one that was the most volatile throughout the period. So formality and informality is a big problem for the region. But as you can see from this graph, in which we depict actually the formality rates of the population. And here by formality, we are going to define it as those who are registered in social security systems, meaning that there are some contributions that are paid for them generally by the employer, the employees, and the state. So they are registered in some contributory scheme. We see that the share of formal people varies in the region quite a lot. We have some countries like Uruguay and Costa Rica and Chile where the rates of formality are very high, to some countries like Honduras, Guatemala, Bolivia, and Peru, where the shares of formality are very low and the shares of informality instead are very high. And informality, we're gonna define it as the residual between the formal workers and the total workers throughout the presentation. And why informality is a problem? Because usually it implies lower income levels, and because jobs that are informal are generally outside of regulations and outside of the tax system, meaning that they do not contribute, they do not pay taxes, and that generates a problem for governments that have to face a situation with lower resources that they can spend for the public. And also people who are in the formal sector, by definition in this case, are out of the social safety net. And so they have increased risks of being outside of the healthcare insurances and retirement plans and so on and so forth. And also they have more limited access to credit and therefore insurance and investment possibilities, which also can limit the growth. A short literature review, very, very short, just focusing here on what role informality played in the past during crisis. So in general, during crisis, informality has been documented to be very counter-cyclical. There are many papers that document it, including work by Gustavo, and they basically find that informality acts as a shock absorber. So when there is an economic downturn, we see a rise in informality. And I will stop it there. But that's one of the facts from previous crises. And now, as we will see throughout the presentation and as it's being documented in other works, the situation is being very different. There is a recent paper from the IMF by Alvarez and Pizzinelli that looks at the labor markets in Colombia, and they see that during the COVID, exactly what we find during the COVID, so the informality decreased. So contrary to the expectations, in a crisis, you would expect informality to go up. This was a very particular crisis. Informality went down because of the lockdowns and all the issues related to it, and to the health issues. And so they see that informality went down during the shock. But then in December 2020, they see that it spiked up again. And interestingly, it went above the levels pre-pandemic. And then we have another recent report by the ILO, also from September 2021, and they look at 8 countries in Latin America and the Caribbean, and they also find the same pattern. During COVID, there was a decrease in the informality, but then they look at the first quarter of 2021, which is data that we didn't have yet when we did this paper. And for the first quarter in 2021, they see that informality bounces back, and in some countries even goes beyond the pre-pandemic levels. So now let's see what happens. So what we see in the data, first of all, is that between the first quarter of 2020 and the second quarter of 2020, there was a huge increase in the share of inactive people, so people outside of the labor market. And this reflects a big drop that there was in the share of informal workers within the working age population, whereas the formality share, the share of formal workers, remained kind of stable throughout the period. And then in the third quarter, informality started to rise again, and inactivity started to go back down. So this is the trend that we started to see in 2020. And so informality was the main factor of adjustment during the crisis. And this increase in the inactivity share had a massive gender imbalance. As you can see from the graph on the left, most of the people who went outside of the labor force were women, which can be related to many factors, but that's what happened. And also we see a correlation with the age of the population. So the young ones are the ones that paid more the cost, let's say. So they were more likely to leave the labor force. So what we think could happen in the future. So we do a couple of very simple estimations to have an idea. First of all, we do what we call the macro estimate. So we take a panel of 16 countries in the region, and we look at what happens in these countries between 1990 and 2019. And we try to capture the elasticity of informality with respect to changes in wage. So we look at the share of informality in country I at time t as a function of the wages, as a function of the working age population in agriculture, the percentage of the economically active population in agriculture of the one who are young. We also look at the levels of education, and we look at the ones who are female. And then we control for year fixed effects and country fixed effects. And so why do we use these functional form, and why don't we use other variables? We tried many things. We interacted other terms, we squared them, we did many things, but this was the model that gave us the best fit, as you will see more clearly in the following graphs. What we're interested in the most, what we want to focus on the most here, is the coefficient beta 1. So the relationship between informality and wages, which in this case, as you can see from the table, was minus 0.2, meaning that for lower wages, you expect to see a higher share of informal workers. Our thinking here was, okay, so let's take the projections for GDP growth in the following years from the IMF, and we took the World Economic Outlook to have these projections. Then we used the correlation between GDP growth and wages of individuals from another paper where we had calculated that. And so that way we have the relationship between GDP and income, and then wages. And here we use the relationship between wages and informality. And this way we can back out a number that could be a prediction of what could happen to informality. Of course, this is a correlation. The idea here is that if you have lower productivity workers, lower wages, you are less able to pay for social contribution, for security contributions. And so they are more likely to be informal, or of course, this is all endogenous, you can go the other way, but we just wanted the elasticity and to do some predictions. As you can see from the graph, the gray solid line is the average share of informality for the 6 countries that we observe up to 2019. The dashed line, dashed blue and black, is the one predicted by the model. So as you can, and that's the reason why we stuck with this model, because it is very close to what actually happened. Our prediction is that in the future, once the recovery starts, and this is going to depend on the velocity of stopping lockdowns and getting the population vaccinated and the economic recovery, and that will be followed by an overshoot of informality. Instead, what we saw in 2020 for the 9 countries that we observed is that the rate of informality, the solid blue line, went down from 59% to 56.2. That's the big decrease in informality. And then we look at it from another angle, but we kind of look at the same story. So here we look instead at some micro projections where we take only the cross section of 16 countries, and we look at how at the relationship between being informal, the probability of being informal, depending on other variables such as income, gender, whether you are in a rural area, the age cohort, the education, and the sector in which you work on. And here as well, our point is that even by looking at this, we would expect the share of informal people to go up, and for the reasons that we were saying before, because for the income loss that they experience during the pandemic, they will, once they can, they will look for a job, and that's more likely to be informal. And so that's why we predict this overshoot. And then we think, okay, let's play also with some sectoral composition changes. We have seen that during GDP growth declines, usually the share of people working in manufacturing drops, and the one working in commerce and hotel and restaurants increases. So let's pretend that a 5%, let's imagine that a 5% of people will move from the manufacturing sector to commerce and hotels and restaurants. If that was the case, because these sectors are also see a larger share of informality, then we would expect informality to be even higher. And so what can be some mitigation policies to cushion this increase in informality? The first scenario that we're going to look at is the increase in human capital. What happens if there was 1 extra year of education for the employed population of 15 years old and above? In the second scenario, we exempt the working population from payment of income taxes. Of course, for the formal population, who are the ones who pay for it. And we assume that this exemption is going to be translated into higher wages. And so because higher wages are related to the probability of being formal, then how for that cushion the rise in informality. And the third scenario, we do pretty much the same thing. We look at the exemption from social security contributions for employers and workers in the formal sector, and we assume that this will translate in average wages and higher, and we see what happens there. Then we do other calculations as well, where we oblige these resources to be used to create new formal jobs. But for the sake of time, I skipped those in the presentation, but they're in the paper. So these are the results of the simulation. You can look at the last column on the right, which is last bar on the right, which is the average for Latin America. The 3 percentage point increase in informality is what we could expect given the assumptions of the model. And in that case, if you had an extra year of education for the population, you see that you would have a decrease of 1.6% percentage points of this increase in informality. The scenario one is the one where we increase the average education. And in the second scenario, where we exempt workers from tax payments, we see a further decrease of 1.6. And then if we exempted workers from paying social security contributions or employers from paying social security contributions, we would have a further decrease in informality. So concluding, COVID had an unprecedented impact on the labor market in the region. We see a big increase in the share of inactive workers and the large decrease in the share of informality, whereas the formal sector acted more as a social safety net, given its lower flexibility. Again, it's not that, I mean, the formal sector lost anyway workers, but nowhere near what happened to the informal sector. And yeah, you can think of this for the rigidities of the formal sector and the flexibilities of the informal sectors, and the particular issues that were related to lockdowns and affected more the informal sector, and also the particular economic shock that COVID entailed that affected more the informal sector, and the particular health shock that COVID entailed that affected more the informal sector, who is less likely to be insured. And our forecast is that after COVID, once we start the recovery, the average informality will go up, which is something that the papers that came later and had more recent data start to see in the region. And to cushion this growth of informality, not formality, of informality, where we explored some of the policies, some that were adopted during COVID by governments, and some other, like postponing or forgiving income tax payments and social security contributions, or increasing the education of the population. And we see that could help to mitigate the issue. Of course, these are not the only policies. Of course, there are other things that, given, for example, that we saw the gender imbalance of the rise in the inactivity share, there could be other policies that are more tailored to specific parts of the population. So these are nowhere near the only ones that can be explored. It was just to give an example. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Julia. Okay, great management of the time. So now, any question for the audience?
So if no one's going to ask a question, I do have a question. So when you're thinking about, especially the context of education in an extra year, are you also thinking about the human capital potentially lost to the loss of schooling during the pandemic? And the other thing is whether an extra year can also help to delay entry into the job market, and that way maybe alleviate some of those constraints. And the other thing I was also thinking about was, what about flexibilizing labor laws to decrease the cost of hiring as well, whether it might be a good time for those types of policies. I'm familiar with the context of Argentina more, and I think that's relevant in particular to Argentina, but not sure about the rest of the region. So,
thank you, Nicolas, for the very good questions. Concerning the human capital loss during the pandemic, you point out to a huge problem that affected, certainly, as we all know, the most vulnerable because of many issues, the lack of internet connection, and the difficulties to follow education online, driven by many factors. That the forecast is that this will have huge effects on the inequality in the future. So you point out to a big problem. What we explore with this 1 year increase in the average schooling is certainly something that cannot be adopted immediately. It's something more in the long term. So concerning the delay in the entry into the job market, I think if it was super fast, let's say. So if it happened immediately, probably it would be on time for COVID, but I think it's in this context, I see it as extremely unlikely. So that's why we consider it more as a longer term issue. In terms of the flexibility of labor markets, that's another great point. That's another great point. I'm not gonna say too much about it. So like what we see in the paper, and I will stick to that, is that the rigidity of the formal sector helped to mitigate the impacts, and so the factor of adjustment was really the informal sector, and vice versa. During the recovery, the opposite happened because of the more flexibility is what they are seeing now that is the one driving the recovery in employment, basically. But that's you point out to a very big.
Okay, we have another question from Alan. Alan, do you want to turn on your audio or? Oh, okay, great.
I mean, yeah, I mean, it can be done later if there is no time, but just thanks for the presentation, Julia. I was just wondering about composition effects, because we have also observed in Peru that some people were forced to actually enter the labor market because of the crisis. Like if the head of the household loses a job, then the younger members need to look for a job to compensate. So yeah, I mean, maybe we can discuss about this later, but just wondering about this composition effect and the implications for your findings.
Oh, thanks a lot for Alan. We can totally talk about it more than happy to. So it's exactly what we think is going to happen, and one of the factors that will be driving the overshoot that we expect later. That's exactly one of the mechanisms that we think about. So there was a loss of income, and it could be because more members of the household went out of the labor force, and so there is a need for compensation. And so that's exactly one of the mechanisms that we think it could happen even more in the future, but more than happy to discuss it further.
Okay, there's one more question. Nicolas, don't worry, you can take my time. But this is good having questions. So, okay, from Sergio Rivera, could you use the rollout of vaccines as variable that defines the return to previous economic activity and thus the resulting informality and the level of participation shares?
So, one second, could you use the rollout of vaccines as a variable that defines the return to previous economic activity? And thus the result, yeah, so not totally the vaccinations are gonna be one of the factors that is, no, it's a very, yes, Sergio, this is a very good point. This is one of the factors that is gonna dictate part of the recovery, because if more people are able to return to working because of the vaccines and the economy reopens, then yes, we're gonna see an increase in the people who are employed, and that's definitely is one of the variables that will dictate when this overshooting informality is going to happen. So yeah, you could even think of some paper on this, using that as some instrument, but not totally. Okay,
great. Thank you. Thanks, Julia. Okay, so our next presenter is Nicolas. Go ahead.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, Gustavo. Thanks for chairing the session, and thank you all for joining today. So I'm Nicolas Botan, and this is joint work with Dieter Borremann, Bridget Hoffman, Carabo Jackson, and Diego Viracosio. And the question we're exploring in this paper is whether education prevents job loss during economic downturns. And we'll exploit evidence from exogenous school assignments that'll give us a source of exogenous identification to education, to schooling. So the fact that workers with more years of education experience fewer job losses during economic downturns has been widely documented throughout the literature. But there are a number of issues when we're thinking about whether this correlation is causal or not. So for example, we can think that higher productivity workers might be more likely to select into education and also into professions that are less exposed to economic recessions, right? So if we think about trying to identify the causal relationship between education and fewer job losses during recessions, studying this causal link is hard in practice because it requires a number of inputs. So on the one hand, ideally, we'd like longitudinal data where we can link educational attainment and educational outcomes to people's labor market outcomes. On the other hand, we also need some sort of exogenous variation in educational attainment to be able to identify the causal effect of education. And furthermore, we also need repeated measures of labor market outcomes so that we can track people over time around the context of a recession to see how labor market participation changes before, during, and after a recession. Okay, so in this paper, we're able to check the three of these boxes in order to answer this question about whether education does prevent job loss during an economic downturn. So to do that, what we do is first we match administrative education records from 1987 to 2002 with nationally representative surveys that were conducted before, during, and after the onset of COVID-19 in Barbados. And we're able to use exogenous variation in school assignment, given the way that the schooling system, the public schooling system, works in Barbados. And to do this, we're extending work by Berman and Jackson that exploited this variation in school assignments. So just to describe it briefly in a nutshell, and then I'll go into detail, at the end of primary school, kids take an exam, and based on those exams, high schools have admission cutoffs, right? So we can exploit the fact that some kids are just above and just below those cutoffs to look at the effect of admission to a preferred school and see how that affects educational attainment and later on labor market outcomes. So let me give you a quick preview of our findings. First of all, we document that women who scored just above the threshold attain on average almost 3 more years of education. And at the same time, we find no effect on educational attainment for men. And later on, during the onset of the recession induced by COVID-19, we see that these women who see an increase in educational attainment are less likely to have lost their jobs during the recession. So they're 33 percentage point less likely. At the same time, we do not find any differences for men. So we do a number of tests to see what might be driving this effect, and we find evidence that these effects are not driven by sectoral changes or changes in labor supply, and I'll be talking about this a little more. So just to briefly frame this paper in the context of the literature, so in this paper, we're providing causal evidence of this protective effect of education that has been well documented. And also we're contributing to the very long and ongoing debate about the human capital and signaling value of education. So the results we find at the end of the day are inconsistent with models of pure signaling value of education. And the results suggest that education indeed enhances worker skill, right? So just briefly, the idea is that if education is just pure signaling of people's ability, well, people just above and just below the threshold at the end of primary have similar ability. So then we shouldn't expect to see differences in job losses when there are differences in education later on, but nevertheless we do, which suggests that indeed it does enhance worker skills. And also these results provide empirical support for many theoretical models that predict that if education does indeed enhance human capital, then more educated workers should be less susceptible to job losses during a recession. Okay, so first let me give you a little bit of background on the educational context of Barbados and also describe the process of applying to secondary school. So when finishing primary, students have to take the Barbados Secondary School entrance exam. This is a standardized test. And before sitting down to take the exam, everyone has to submit their rank ordered lists of secondary schools, right? So they have to submit their preferences and then they take the exams. And after that, students are ranked across 2 dimensions. So students are mainly ranked on their entrance exam score within each gender. And then the way assignment works is based on these rankings, they go by each student, and students are assigned to their first choices until those schools are full, in which case they move to their number 1, number 2 choice, and so on and so forth. So ultimately, this mechanism generates test score cutoffs, and these cutoffs, given that it depends on the number of applicants, the distribution of scores, preferences submitted, and so on, these cutoffs change every year, right? So it's very hard for parents or students to anticipate what these cutoffs will be. So in this context, what we do is, first we obtain administrative data that contains the entrance exam scores for all students between 1987 and 2002. And the reason we cut off at 2002 is because later this data is combined with the 2016 Barbados Survey of Living Conditions. And the idea is to look at labor market outcomes. So those who took the test in 2002 are old enough in 2016 as to be able to observe their labor market outcomes. And to do this, we rely on the work that's already been done by Dieter and Bo, where they merged this administrative data to the living conditions data. And they did an awesome job at this. So the match rate was over 90%. So what we did during the onset of the pandemic was follow up with the sample from the living conditions survey. And we followed up via telephone surveys. And we did this in 2 waves. The first wave was in May 2020, right during the peak of the recession generated by the pandemic. And in this first telephone survey, we had a follow-up rate of about 52%. And then later on in November, once a lot of the COVID restrictions were relaxed and the labor market had significantly recovered by then, we followed up again. And there the follow-up rate was about 47% relative to the 2016 survey. Now, it's important to note in the paper, we of course test for differential response rates, and we show that response rates are smooth across these cutoffs, and we don't find evidence of differential response rates to our surveys. So just to give you a broad idea about employment trends during this time, back in 2016, where the living conditions survey was conducted, employment rates for men and women were roughly about 80%. And these remained fairly stable until right before the onset of the pandemic in February 2020. And in May 2020, at the height of the recession, we see that there was a significant decline in employment rates for both men and women, where the drop was about 20 percentage points for each. Later on, by November 2020, after restrictions were relaxed and labor markets recovered, we can see that labor employment rates bounced back and came pretty close to the initial employment rates for both men and women. So to study the causal effect of education on the probability of losing their jobs during this time, what we do is we exploit this discontinuity in test scores, and we estimate a 2-stage least square model. We're in the first stage. What we're doing is we're using these cutoffs to predict whether or not a student attends a preferred school based on their rank ordered list. And then we can look at the effect of attending a preferred school on our outcomes of interest. So at first, we're going to look at how attending a preferred school affects years of education, and then we'll look at employment, the probability of losing the job, and so on. Okay, so when estimating these models, in our baseline specifications, we're controlling for a cubic functional form for the test scores. which is interacted with the above dummy. But in the paper, we show that our results are robust to using different functional forms of the running variable. And also, each individual has multiple cutoffs, and following the standard in the literature, we stack the data to study this and include cutoff fixed effects as well. So this empirical strategy relies on the traditional assumptions whenever we're doing a regression discontinuity, which is that essentially nothing other than the change in the admission probability to a preferred school changes discontinuously at the cutoff. And in the paper, we provide a lot of different evidence suggesting that this assumption is indeed plausible and is indeed satisfied. So first, we show that the density of the distribution of observations is smooth across the cutoff in both our survey sample and also in the full population. Also, we show that different predetermined covariates vary smoothly across the cutoff. We also find that there's no change in likelihood of either being matched from the admin data to the survey data or in responding our surveys. And also, we find that the first stage, so the effect of this cutoff on attending a preferred school is strong, and this strongly predicts whether someone actually attends a preferred school. So let me show you what that first stage looks like in these two figures. So what we can see is we're looking at the effect of being just above this test score cutoff on the probability of attending a preferred school. And the effect sizes are roughly similar for both women and men. So it increases the probability of attending a preferred school by about 86 percentage points. Okay, so the first thing we want to do is look at how attending a preferred school affects educational attainment. So we're looking at the effect of attending a preferred school on years of education. And similar to the work that has previously been done by Dieter and Bo, so we're replicating the results in our sample, we find a significant increase in educational attainment for women, but no significant increase for men. And our two-stage least square estimates suggest that attainment for women increases by almost 3 years, whereas for men, it's not statistically distinguishable from zero. And if anything, it's slightly negative. So the first thing we look at is the effects on employment. So this is the probability of being employed at different points in time. So first, we're looking back in 2016 based on the living conditions survey. And back then, we see that the point estimates are positive, but not statistically distinguishable from zero. We find a similar pattern in early 2020 before the pandemic. And we see the large difference at the height of the recession, where attending a preferred school has no effect on being employed for men, but for women, it significantly increases the probability of being employed by about 60 percentage points. And then after the recovery, again, we go back to a situation similar to pre-pandemic times. And sorry, Gustavo, just until what time am I going?
Okay, you have time until 1:10. Yeah.
10. Okay, thanks.
You have 10 minutes, sorry. Yeah.
Awesome. Okay, so next what we do is we look at the effects of attending a preferred school on job loss during the pandemic. So here our dependent variable is conditioning on being employed in February 2020 and looking at the probability of whether people are employed in May 2020 during the height of the recession. So here what we find is that for women, the probability of losing their job at this point decreases significantly, and our estimates suggest that it decreases by about 36 percentage points. And in turn, for men, we find no significant change, right? Which is also consistent with the fact that we don't find any significant effects of attending a preferred school on educational attainment for men. So in the paper, we show that these results are robust to a number of checks. So we find similar estimates when we vary bandwidth size, for changing the functional form of our running variable. Also, we don't see any evidence of differential response rates across the cutoffs, and population weights don't affect our estimates.
I have a question. Could I ask?
Yeah,
I mean,
so,
don't worry about the time. Right? You can time. You always take my time. So
we're good with time. So
if you go back one slide, I mean, I know this thing on using the polynomials, right? Especially for women. So you have a very few number of dots there. So I know you introduce robust to quadratic and okay, but how confident are you guys with the polynomial you fit into this few number of dots? Because it could seem that because it's a theory of the polynomial, it's just adjusting, just trying to reach, for example, the very dot that is at the very horizontal line, the threshold. So I'm just concerned about, of course, in men it's clearly linear, right? But in women, I don't know. I mean, I know you're plotting their confidence interval, but how is this? So you plot, for example, a linear regression rate there. It's hard to say how much is the difference or if this is significant or not.
Yeah, so I don't remember the exact point estimates for the different type of specifications, but we do try different functional forms and the general results hold. I mean, so one thing that you mentioned is true. The sample sizes are relatively small in this study. So in general, we don't have that much power for doing finer comparisons. But yeah, in general, these results are robust to different functional forms. So, thanks. Yep. Okay, so in the paper, we explore a number of mechanisms because there can be a number of alternative explanations other than education that can potentially drive these effects. And what we show is that on the one hand, women job losses are entirely driven by layoffs and not voluntary separations. Then also another concern we had was that, well, maybe education is affecting the likelihood of having children, and that can affect whether or not women might have to stay home taking care of their children, or on the other hand, maybe it was easier to receive external help with children during the pandemic, and that could be driving these differential responses. And we find no evidence that it either affected the probability of having young children in the household, or it neither affected the probability of receiving external help with children during the pandemic. So another concern is also that, well, maybe education affects tenure in the job. And it's been well documented that during a recession, newer hires tend to get laid off first, right? So we also test whether attending a preferred high school affects pre-pandemic tenure. And again, we don't find any evidence that this is so. So it doesn't seem to be driven by differences in tenure. So then when we think about the ways in which education can potentially be reducing layoffs for women, there are two potential stories we thought about. So on the one hand, we can think that, well, maybe education increases productivity, and once hiring a worker, employers are able to observe an employee's true productivity. So during a recession, they want to keep high productivity workers, right? So in that case, education would having a direct effect on a worker's productivity. And this is something that, of course, we cannot directly test because we don't observe workers' productivity. Now, another concern is that, well, maybe more educated workers self-select into more recession-proof jobs. And then ultimately, it's not so much the effect of education, but it's the selection into different types of sectors or occupations. Okay, so we tried to test the extent to which this might be driving our results. And what we do is, for each employee, we calculate the predicted pandemic-related job losses for their particular occupation and sector in their pre-pandemic job. And we look at the effect of attending a preferred school on this predicted job loss for their particular occupation and sector. and we find no evidence that it affects that probability. So this provides some suggestive evidence that it does not seem to be necessarily driven by selection into certain occupations or sectors. So one thing that we were curious about was what was happening also during the time of the recovery. So I showed you a graph earlier showing employment over 2020, where at the height of the recession, there was a big drop of employment, and later on towards the end of the year, when a lot of the restrictions were relaxed and the economy had recovered, employment had also significantly recovered in turn. So on the one hand, we don't find differences in being employed for women in November between those that are just above and below the cutoff, suggesting that those who had lost their jobs during the recession were rehired later on, but they weren't rehired in the same types of jobs or in the same types of paying this. They weren't hired at the same wages, sorry. So what we're looking at in this table is the effect of attending a preferred school on household income. So one thing we can observe is that before the pandemic, there is no significant difference for women between those who attend preferred schools. And then consistent with the job loss effects, we see that there is a large and significant increase in income for women who are just above the threshold, reflecting the fact that more likely the women who lost their jobs during this time were those that were in lower wage jobs, right? Okay, so towards the end of the year, when a lot of those who have been laid off were rehired or got a new job, what we see is that this difference in incomes persists over time, which suggests that women who were rehired and previously lost their job were rehired at lower wages, right? Because recall that before the pandemic, there was no significant difference in wages between these groups. So these results suggest that less educated women were affected in two ways by the pandemic. On the one hand, they were more likely to lose their job. And on the other hand, when they rejoin the labor force, they do so at lower wages. And this can potentially have implications for long-term effects on welfare. So I'm right on time, so I'll conclude and leave some time for questions. So in this paper, we use exogenous variation in school assignments to estimate the causal effect of educational attainment on job loss during a recession. And we document that women who attend their preferred schools are less likely to experience job loss during a recession. And we find no impacts for men. And again, these results are not consistent with education acting as a pure signal of workers' ability. So just one thing that's worth mentioning, that in this work, where our estimates do not include any general equilibrium effects of the impact of increasing education for the entire population, right? So that's something to keep in mind, that these are local treatment effects. So thanks so much, and I think we have time. So
yeah, we have. So thank you, Nicolas. So any question for the audience?
Yes, can I ask a question? So thanks a lot, Nicolas, for the presentation. Super interesting work. I was wondering if among the mechanisms you consider the fact that self-esteem could play a role as well. I don't know, I'm thinking of the effects of rejection. In the end, the women that didn't get to the preferred school were rejected somehow, and the others were accepted and confirmed. I was wondering whether you consider that could be a mechanism as well for future decisions of the women involved. And then when you were talking about the mechanisms again, and you were saying that you couldn't look at productivity, I was wondering if you had wages in the variables, and if there was anything there that could help you disentangle this mechanism, and as a proxy of productivity. And then you were showing the
sorry to interrupt you, Julia, but it got cut when you were saying if we have something, and I didn't hear that something. So
no worries, I'm being censored by Zoom. No, I think on no, if you have the wages.
Oh, wages.
Yes, because perhaps that could help you say something about productivity. I don't know. And then you were showing the effects during the presentation, conditional on women being employed before the pandemic, which I find the most interesting population to look at. But I was wondering if you also looked at women that were not employed before the pandemic, and whether the ones that in the end were more educated, they, I don't know, entered more easily the labor market during the pandemic for I mean, for job losses or I mean, for income losses or things like that, whether you looked at that.
Yeah, thanks so much, Julia. And yeah, great questions. So very interesting point about self-esteem. We don't have any data on that. There might be something in the living conditions survey, but I can't remember off the top of my head, but that would be something interesting to look at. So thanks for that suggestion. When it comes to wages, in the survey, we asked about household income and not individual wages because that was more sensitive. So unfortunately, we don't have individual wages. But something we do know is whether, so who is the main earner in the household? And for these households, the women are the main earners. So it seems that it is reflecting mostly their wages. But yeah, it's unclear whether also wages changed during the recession or it's a pure composition change, right? So we can't say anything about that. And then the effects on the sample of women who were not employed before. I think we did look at that, but I cannot remember off the top of my head. But yeah, that would be interesting. So thanks for your questions.
Thanks.
Okay, Alan, do you have a question, Alan?
Yeah, I mean, if there is time, but just a quick question. Hi, Nicolas. Thanks for the presentation. Very interesting. Yeah, I was just wondering. Maybe you mentioned this and I missed it, but to what extent the result could be driven by having the university degree? Is it just purely years of schooling in general, or is it having the university degree that makes a difference? I wonder if you can isolate that. And the second point, more like a comment around policies, that where maybe you could use the results to make a point that because you have a gender gap that I think from what I could see, it increased the gender gap, but it will have been even larger where it's not for the impact of education, because in a way education should reduce the gender gap because of what you explained, and maybe you can make that point at the end of the paper.
Yeah, thanks so much for the suggestion on the gender gap. That's a good observation. And regarding the university degree, yeah, you're right that attending a preferred school increased the probability that women have a university degree. So to the extent that later on that's being reflected in the type of profession or occupation that women get into, we don't find evidence that that's driving this effect. So if it's the additional education, it seems that that the benefit through increasing human capital is what's driving these effects, and not so much something like signaling or some other mechanism. Thanks for your question.
Thank you, Nicolas.
Okay, any other question?
Oh, I forgot to stop sharing, sorry.
No, it's fine. Okay, otherwise, okay, it's my turn. Could you see the slides?
Yes, perfect.
Thank you. All right, so thanks for being here. This is a joint work with Israel Mora from Banco de Mexico as well. So in this paper, and you can see from the title already, we take a pessimistic view of at least 3 measures of teleworking that have been proposed in the literature, and including one we proposed. So we basically, this paper is basically applying these 3 definitions of teleworking. I could elaborate on what are the difference between the definitions, these 3 definitions. But we evaluate this measure of teleworking in Latin America, 5 countries. And then what we ask is to what extent teleworking has helped to act as a shock absorber, or is this being beneficial for people just to mitigate a loss of employment? Okay, so I'm going to start with an overview of how teleworking how teleworking works in Latin America. So I'm presenting here. This is a big table, I know, but in panel A, where I'm reporting the telework share as original reported in the paper. So, for example, DNN is of course the Dinkla-Naiman, a famous teleworking measure, and then we plot or we report this for this Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Mexico, and Peru. And you see that in general, in average for the two countries that they have in the sample, it's actually 1/4 of overall employment in these three countries, able to do doing teleworking. Okay, that doesn't the measure. GGPS is an alternative measure, and this was proposed for especially for developing countries. Using the STEP survey, and for our sample of countries, this one reported for Colombia, and you can already see the difference between GGPS and DN. So GGPS actually they acknowledge that DN could be measures could be like overestimating the extent of the work in the region. And then LM is Leva Mora is our measure. And we did this original for Mexico only, and then we calculate 10% of employment doing teleworking before the pandemic. For all these measures are ex-ante measures that just DNN, you know this probably. They use the on the questionnaires, and then they have more information that we do, and just to discriminate between telework jobs and non-telework jobs. Using information like, for example, the use of electronic mail in doing your task or job. GGPS, as I said, they use the STEP survey, and then using the survey, they try to classify jobs according to the user technologies. And our measure probably is less sophisticated because we just based on our reading of job description of all these jobs available in Mexico, for example, 400 jobs, and that's probably our advantage to compare with to the other two measures. We just assess if a job could be done from home or not. So, for example, and this is it's a clear example, a job in the manufacturing sector, for example. An employee in manufacturing sector, okay, is unable to do telework, but a guy like me doing job for a central bank, okay, I could do telework. Okay, panel B is our replication, because as you can see in panel A, there is empty spots. So we try to replicate using the respective measures. So you can see that we do well. DN, sorry, Brazil is our measure is a little bit lower than the original reported. For Chile is close to that, and then the advantage that we can report, for example, for Colombia and from Peru, for the missing countries, GGPS as well, and then LM, which is then our measure to the rest of countries. And then, so basically here the takeaway is that DN it seems to be like an overestimation of the working possibilities in the region, and our measure, if you want, is like in the middle way between DN and GGPS. Now, these correlates nicely with informality rate, which is panel C. So we're reporting like the share in overall employment of informal workers, and you can see the difference, the huge heterogeneity across the region. In average, is 50%, but then you compare, for example, Chile is just like a third of employment, and Peru is shockingly like a 71%. And you can see from this table that there is a negative correlation between teleworking possibilities and informality rate, which makes sense in our countries. And then we also report like teleworking share in informal employment, and of course this is no surprise because I just said it, is that the shares are much lower, because informal employment is like the guy who's selling tortillas in the streets and so on. Okay, so this is like an overview. So what we're gonna do now is this is just like if you want like average values as of 2019. So what we're gonna do is use 5 household unemployment surveys. You can see the details there. So for Mexico we use the NOE. And the combination of NOE, TOE, and blah, blah, blah. For Peru, the NOW, which is a household survey. For Colombia, the GIH. For Chile, the ENE, which is only an employment survey. It's not the CACEN, for example. In Brazil, is the discontinuous PNAD, which is close to NOE's, to Mexico's NOE. Okay, so we want to basically just input these teleworking definitions in occupational classification in these countries. So of course, this is not harmonized like data like you have in IDB or the ELO, for example, and then you just can use, for example, the ISCO classification system. We're using here the classification system, the occupational classification system of each country. They may differ. They of course are close to the ISCO, as in Chile. Chile is exactly ISCO, but in the rest of countries like in Brazil, Colombia, Mexico, and Peru, there are like adaptations of the ISCO classification. Of course, I mean, there is an advantage of having just one classification, a harmonized classification, but at the same time, our advantage is that we can potentially use our data set to report not only like aggregate employment, for example, or aggregates, labor market aggregates, but also, for example, see what happened by gender, by age, and so on. Okay, so this is basically what we do. This is the mapping of occupational classifications in Latin America, in this group of 5 countries. So we take, and this is like doing Nyman, but instead of using US employment weights, we use Mexican employment weights, which is, I guess, like in a sense, is better than using the US employment weights to extrapolate our classification, for example, to the rest of countries and also the GEPS. So, and you see here, for example, how the Cinco, this is for Mexico, this is like the pivot, the Cinco of 2011. So we basically do the mapping between this, the Cinco, the Mexican classification system of occupations, to this for the ISCO. They're going to be helpful to in turn extrapolate to Brazil. This is Brazil, and also to Peru. This is for Peru, and also the 4-digit ISCO in 88 for Peru in this sample and before 2016. And then, as you can see, it's not straightforward because in some cases, in some household surveys, like in Chile, this is Chile, although they use the ISCO exactly, the ISCO 2008, they only have this data available at 1 digit ISCO, so that's bad. And then for Colombia, which is the last one here, they actually use the 6CA, which is 1 digit. So you can see here the discrepancies between the ISCOs and different years and blah blah. But we try to make the correlation anyways consistent. Okay, this is how these 3 measures of teleworking look like. So DN, again, Nyman, GGPS, the GOTLEB, and all. And this is our measure level. Okay, so here I'm plotting for each measure, like for all countries. Okay, like the deviation of how the employment, the share of non-telework employment in overall employment, what we call the non-telework shares of employment evolved during the pandemic. So you see that in all cases, but Peru, and this is interesting, and then I'm going to try to explain why this happens, but in all countries but Peru, of course, the share of non-telework employment dropped, meaning that this could be a compositional change, right? So meaning that all in jobs that couldn't be done from a job, then we lost it. Of course, we see differences across countries. So, for example, Chile, and it's consistent across measures. The other thing we see from this graph is that although we see teleworking like a key dimension to understand what happened in labor markets in Latin America, we're seeing like this reversion and quick reversions of these measures, meaning that I mean, if we thought that, for example, like myself, right? I wanna keep my job and doing teleworking all the time. Well, that's not gonna hold. So just we see quick reversion of these shares and non-telework employment. And Peru, we speculate that this is because the relation that this has with informality, and then I'm going to show you a graph for Brazil and Mexico only. But we speculate is because the link between teleworking or non-teleworking with informality. And finally, another takeaway from this is the size of this movement. So basically, and that's why we said that we're pessimistic about what these measures could tell us is that the change in these measures are low. I mean, it's 3% as compared to the fourth quarter of 2019. So these changes, yes, but they're small. Okay, so I wanna try to formalize this idea of trying to decompose the non-telework employment. This is why the zero stands for, the non-telework employment, for example, jobs in manufacturing sector, if you want, in construction sector, as a share of working age population. And we wanna decompose this as follows. So we wanna have this as the product of the share of non-telework employment. This is the share. This is employment in non-telework jobs and overall employment. And this is gonna be the usual employment rate. So basically, when I compose this time series into aggregate shocks, what we call aggregate shock, which is the aggregate employment rate, and into this, if you want, idiosyncratic shocks, like doing with the ability of doing telework at home or not. Okay, so at the end, we want to try to see how much of the variance in this non-telework employment share, as a share of the working age population, is due to the idiosyncratic ability to do telework or not, or due to these aggregate employment rate shocks.
Gustavo?
Yes.
Yes, sorry, just a quick clarification question out of ignorance. So an agricultural work, is it non-telework or is it excluded?
No, it's non-telework, for example.
Thank you.
Yeah, and that's gonna they're gonna hold across all these measures, if I remember well. I mean, for us, it holds, of course. Okay, so then basically when I do this, run this decomposition, and then this is the results of the estimation results. In one, this is we use two countries. I mean, the two largest countries in the region, Mexico and Brazil. And then we exploit because as you can see from here, it's nice. We have like a 1 year of pandemic by now, but still is quarterly data is like 4 or 5 quarters. It's a short time dimension. So we exploit the state variation in these two countries. In Brazil, we have 27 states. In Mexico, we have 32. And so this is a panel regression. We use a pool and panel regression controlling for fixed effects. And basically, what this is saying is that basically the bulk of the variance in this non-telework employment rate, if you want, has to do with this here, this gamma mu, which is this stands for the aggregate shocks, meaning this guy here, and non-match has to do with the idiosyncratic teleworking share. So you see here, for example, in Mexico, it's almost nothing. So almost full of the variance in this non-telework employment rate is due to aggregate shocks, so nothing to do with teleworking. And in Brazil, it's more balanced. Probably the maximum is 20% if we use the uncontrolled without controls. But when we control, well, it's always similar. Okay, so from this we conclude that what is shaping, what is driving the movement is in this telework sharing in employment is not much teleworking, the ability to do telework or not, sadly, but it seems to be more driven by these aggregate shocks. Now, part of this could be due to the informality, right, which is interesting in the region. We know that, and then you may say, oh, okay, yeah, your results are driven because of informality, because you have a 50% in average in the region in the informal sector, and that's why they can do telework, and then they may drop in your results. Okay. That may be true because here I'm plotting, again, this is exploiting the state variation in Brazil and Mexico, and here in the y-axis I'm plotting the non-telework share. And here in the horizontal axis, the informality rate, and you see clearly the relationship, the almost linear relationship you want between these two objects. Which again makes sense because teleworking and also informality has a sector component. So what we're going to do now, and I'm running out of time, we do a composition in the paper trying to give like a room for this hypothesis that informality is the culprit and why we don't find like this teleworking ability doing or having these beneficial effects in the economy. And then we basically ruled that out because what we're saying is that when we control for its effects in these pandemic regressions, up to 10% of the variation in digital workshop has to do with informality, right? So yes, they have a room, but it's up at most 10%. Okay, another thing we do in the paper is a placebo test because you may say, yeah, okay, for teleworking is a novel issue in this pandemic recession, pandemic periods. But then what happened in previous recessions, right? So in Brazil, we have this recession in 2014, 2016. It was pretty long. And in Mexico, we have the global financial crisis. And then when we compute when we put these measures in employment back in 2014 for Brazil and 2008 for Mexico, we see also a similar drop in the shared non-telework employment. And then the question is, why we're 7 days? I mean, because in principle, teleworking doesn't need to be be binding in previous recession, non-pandemic recessions. And of course, I mean, this is not also like rocket science. It has to do with sectors. And it's something we're exploring in the next version of the paper, how teleworking interacts with, for example, this lockdown policy, where we're driven, of course, by this sector dimension. For example, manufacturing was closed, construction as well, but then like around October, November, they were like again in green light. So this must be capturing. So what we're saying here is that teleworking measures, including our measure, might be capturing something different, which is due with maybe a set of composition of employment, and that is true. Is true in the previous recession and in this pandemic recession too. Finally, this is the last slide because fortunately we have some survey data exploiting information of whether people did teleworking at home or not. And the question, I mean, the immediate question is how these three teleworking measures compare to actual survey data. And basically the conclusion here for Brazil we use is in the paper is like a COVID-19 module of the PNAC, the continuous PNAC. And for Mexico we use another like COVID module. So and the takeaway from this, and just 1 minute, is that here in the recovery, because as I showed before, let me go back quickly. This dropped, the share of non-telework employment, but then it's recovering fast. So we observed that, and the question is, what happened with the survey data based on the working measures? And then what we're observing here is that the three measures of the ex-ante teleworking measure are like underestimating the recovery. And if we think like this, like if you wanted the tracking model of Friedman, like you have a shock, right? You have this the trough in the recession, and then you go back quickly. Then the recovery is saying something about the initial drop. And then if our measures, the three measures, DNG, EPS, and LM, are underestimating recovery, probably they're also underestimating the first drop, the initial drop. Meaning that we're like, for example, you see here, it's like 1/5 of the recovery, 1.1. This is our measure compared to the survey days in Brazil. And this is 0.2, the recovery, compared to 3 points in this teleworking measure. So I want to leave it at there, but saying that, again, I take away from all these results are pessimistic about what this teleworking measure, ex-ante teleworking could say about this, the ability to work in Latin America. And it is like bad news that surveys around in the region are just stopping, serving like these teleworking conditions. Okay, thank you. And I think we'll have time for questions, but in case you have, go ahead.
Gustavo, a question. No, thanks a lot for the presentation. It looks like there was a lot of work into building the measure. Congrats for that. And so what I understand is one of the problems is the impossibility, obviously, to distinguish between sector and occupation and the teleworking measure, because it's based on that. So I was wondering if you could exploit other sources of variation, if you thought about exploiting other sources. I don't know, I'm thinking out loud, such as internet speed or availability, so that within the same kind of sector and occupation, you might capture a bit more the relevance of teleworking. I don't know, I was wondering.
Yeah, no, thank you. Yeah, so that's why we did in our paper proposing this measure, the LM. So we created with measures from the ENIG, the survey of expenditures and income in Mexico, and also a survey like exclusively like focus on measuring these ticks, this kind of ticks. And then what we saw there is that, yeah, there's a correlation between this, our teleworking measure with this access to internet or to computer and iPad and blah, blah. But it's true that it would be nice to have like these also measures for the rest of countries. And yes, and that adds only to the complexity, as you can imagine, of trying to extend this to all countries. But yeah, that sounds like a useful and helpful dimension to work on. Yeah, thank you. Alan.
Yeah, just if there is time. No, thank you. I mean, actually, I'm actually very happy with all the presentations in this session. So it's really useful. So just one thing about the mechanism here. So in the case of Peru, for instance, I think you know, from a personal perspective, like many people that all older, like not just 65 or older, but even people above 40 like me, were like, even after the lockdown ended, it's just you prefer to stay at home. And if in a situation where all people or all senior people prefer to stay at home and there is no employment insurance, someone has to work at home. So younger people are forced to look for a job. So I was just wondering again about this compositional effect. So it's not the same people that are actually going into the labor market. And the second thing that might be just more specific is to what extent the peak for Peru could also be driven by a shift towards agriculture temporarily, because we know that some people migrated to do agricultural work and then went back to their jobs as soon as they were able to do it.
Yeah, no, sure. This is a good question. So first of all, could you still see my slides? Yes, right? Okay, so with respect to the compositional effects, I could say that in this all these regulations we're controlling, this is what control stands for. We included like the age composition, for example. And that's for example, one of the advantages of doing this for each country, even if the classifications differ, right? I mean, instead of going to the ILO website and then trying to download the data by age and blah, blah, we have like this flexibility because we have the household service. And we control for that, like age composition, also gender, and also the sector composition as well, trying to identify like the content intensive sectors and yeah, and all this regression, the controls, the column stands for that. And then regarding the peak in Peru, yeah, that was surprising because when you read, if you want to read, of course, the GPS paper, which is Gottlieb et al, blah, blah, this is in the European Economic Review, you're gonna see that actually this goes down, like in the rest of countries, and then you say, well, what's going on, right? And the reason is because they're using only the EPE, which is the only covering Lima, which is the capital of Peru. And then here we're using the national representative household, which is the NOW. But the other reason could be, and here I'm gonna like do sorry, this is another paper I presented yesterday, but the other reason could be that in Peru was the only country that in which the informality rate increased. I mean, I heard that you use, for example, administrative data in Peru, like from the Ministerio del Trabajo, you actually see the opposite. I don't know. I heard that. So, but I mean, just sticking to household service, you see that the only country when informality rate increased in the pandemic was Peru. And then if I go back, I don't know if you see now these slides, And you see now, you now see this relationship, right? So that must be, so basically what is driving these results could be informality. But again, I mean, as I show you here in this regressions, just a little bit for Mexico and Brazil only, because I haven't done this for Peru. You know, for Peru is more difficult because we have departments and then representatives on annual data and blah, blah. But here at least we're saying the informality is not explaining all this variation, but it's still, you know, you can imagine more work to do in this matter. So yeah, I take your comment as I put your comment in my to-do list.
Yeah, I mean, it's embedded. I mean, because I mean, agricultural works are actually informal in most cases, so it's part of the it's part of the it's already there in a way, probably.
Yeah, I agree. Yes, exactly. Okay, so I think that would be all. Sorry for taking so. I think I took more time than I was allowed, but anyways, thank you so much. Thank you, Julia. Thanks, Nicolas, for this amazing session. I see you because of you, not for me. But thank you, and thank you to audience also for being here.
Thanks so much.
Thank you all. Bye.
Bye bye.
Thank you.
Bye, Alan. Good to see you.